Thank you very much, Mr. Hicks. It's a great pleasure to follow my good friend from Cynon Valley, who has emphasised the depth of inequality and despair and impoverishment in her constituency and across Wales due to the cost of living crisis and a long history of cuts we've seen disproportionately in Wales. We are talking, of course, about Wales, and it's worth remembering that Wales is poorer, Wales is sicker, Wales is older, and this was already the case before, tracking back, before the 2010 onwards austerity cuts began to bite. And so remember, let's put this in context, because those austerity cuts cut public services were welfare cuts, and Wales is disproportionately reliant on public service jobs and has more older people and all the rest of it on welfare. So that was the start point. When we knew something like 50,000 extra people across the UK died from austerity through a study that was done by York University, published by the BMJ. Then, of course, we had COVID. Again, we had the background of a poorer, sicker, older nation, where you would have expected, therefore, a much higher death rate. But, in fact, the death rate above the 5-year average was around 13% in Wales. In England, it was 20%. But, of course, the average to start with was much higher because we had a poorer, sicker nation to start with. But that was to the good governance of Mark Drakeford and his Welsh government. And now we've come into a situation where, having had these massive cuts to people who, let's face it, in Wales we're operating at 70% of gross value added, so about average wages about 70% UK average. So we're having cuts and pay freezes on a very difficult situation. So people are suffering more. And obviously we've had Brexit, and I know the Minister's a big fan of Brexit, but 60% of Welsh trade, of course, unlike England, which is more like 48%, trade was to Europe. And again, so the problems we've had, the problems of the Northern Ireland Protocol, again, disproportionately hitting Wales. And obviously it is the case, if there's pay freezes on public sector workers, and you take a typical example, I don't know, of a nurse who's the only breadwinner in a house in the valleys or whatever it is, then that house is then impoverished. And we've all heard the sort of cases that have just been mentioned of children coming home from school, holding back half their free school meal to eat in the evening because they haven't got any food at home, then washing their hair with washing up liquid, and as has been said by others, not on the lights on, etc., etc. We know, from the Trust, there's 14 million people now in poverty. There's, I think it's 2.6 million people are using food banks. This is a UK figure, of course, up 100-fold. And the majority of people who've been using food banks have some level of disability as well. So obviously there is a pressing case for the government to act now, whether it's through indexing social security and the universal benefit uplift, and indeed doing something about rents, which isn't talked about very much. We talk about energy, we talk about food, but also what's happening is that the local housing allowance hasn't been indexed. And and studies have been done by the Bevan Foundation, for example, to show that if you look online of trying to find a private sector rented accommodation in Wales, which fits in with the local housing allowance, it's only about 1%. You can't. So therefore, people are driven into sort of squalid, Rachmanite sort of conditions to live as well. So that's another terrible fact. Now, the Minister, in his intervention, sort of implied, well, it's whose money is this anyway? And what I would suggest is that not only have these cuts been disproportionately hitting Wales, but also, as he knows from a meeting we had last week with Professor Mark Barry, there's been a historical lack of investment in Wales, getting our fair share to boost productivity, to boost jobs, to boost wealth, so we can pay our way. So we know that 1.5% of over the last couple of decades, in terms of rail enhancement investment, is operated about 1.5% of UK total. When we've got 5% of the population, 11% of the rail track. And forward-looking, apart from the historical legacy, if you take 2020 as the baseline moving forward, Wales is being promised £500 million out of an England promise of £106 billion, including HS2, which is outrageous. HS2 is north-south. It's going to help Scotland much more than Wales. Yet Scotland's getting its fair Barnett consequential that if we got it, which would be 90% of the 5% population, would be 4.6 billion. He knows from that meeting that there are actually on the drawing board plans for about 2 to 3 billion, about half the amount that we deserve from now on, as opposed to the legacy, that could really make a big difference to moving us towards net zero, to productivity, to speed, to get people to relocate. Because the truth is that once HS2 starts running, you can get from London to Manchester, instead of 2 hours 10, it's going to take 1 hour 10, but just to get to Swansea, it'll take nearly 3 hours still. So where are you going to put your investment? Well, the answer in the case of Virgin was to take it out of Swansea and put it into Manchester and say that's why. So if you want to go to Staffordshire, instead of taking 1 hour 45, it'll take 45 minutes. So this, again, on the top of the historical inequalities I've mentioned, it's going to hammer Wales again. And the minister sits there and says, oh, who's going to, pay? Well, the way to pay is to invest in the productivity and the future of Wales through moving towards a sort of a green future. We talked about the windfall tax, and let's be very straightforward about the windfall tax. These oil companies are making excess profits. They made $2 trillion, the big five, in the last few decades. And what's happening is they're making these operating profits above cost, and then Putin invades, you have a price hike, and that extra profit, that windfall profit, they've done nothing. That is our money that was paid out of our pockets by the travelling public. That should be given back. In Germany, or in Spain, they're getting free public transport. In Germany, it's €9 for a month. If we did that with windfall tax, everyone could go to work cheaper, we could get green investment into public transport much more quickly in terms of hydrogen and electric, and let's do something innovative. I know the minister might say, well, and then we've provided background for pay settlement, like the rail dispute. So people say, instead of the rail, RMT being told, I tell you what, you can have 3% and 10,000 job cuts. What are you going to do about it? And what do you expect as a strike which was provoked? You could say, well, we're going to put a background where everybody's encouraged to go on public transport, so that we don't need cuts in jobs. There may be a change in jobs, no cuts in jobs, and there'll be more investment, and therefore you don't have to ask for so much. Fine, let's all agree to that. I certainly will give way.
Is that such a good idea? Why aren't the Welsh Labour government doing it in Wales? They have the power to do so.
Can I gently remind the member this is a debate on cost of living in Wales?
Yes, I know.
Not transport. Thank you.
No, I do know that, yeah. And so if we had that, and obviously it's that decision, we haven't got the money to do that, and that's not devolved. We haven't got the money. We haven't got, obviously, the Exchequer runs UK PLC. We all know that. We don't charge the windfall tax. The Welsh Government isn't in a position to put a windfall tax and nationalise the oil companies, sadly. I know they have done something about rail, briefly. I'm not talking about raising taxes. I'm talking about taking back the money that's been stolen from the travelling public by oil companies. They did nothing to get that money other than Putin invading. That they sort we'll have a market price, we'll put the price up, we haven't done anything about it, we'll take the money and we'll fill our pockets. And the government belatedly took a small share of that, and now they're going to give 90% of it back to drill more oil. Well, what they should, of course, be doing is investing in scaling up in things like organic batteries, or things like in Swansea University, where they're saying if you take the renewable energy from wind farms, Madam Chair, then it's only put into the grid at breakfast time and tea time. That wind farm isn't used. So they're saying, well, let's use that wind, create hydrogen, put the hydrogen in the gas grid, which takes up to 40% of hydrogen, as the old coal gas used to, therefore reduce the carbon footprint. Yes, I am talking about Wales, and this is
hydrogen, stretching my tolerance slightly.
Well, if I could mention that this is permissible on a Wales-only basis, and this is what's being suggested by Swansea University that we do. And obviously, we'll have to work in cooperation with the UK government to do this. But the idea would be then we put that gas into the grid, or the hydrogen we would put into cylinders, and of course, is sent to Ceredigion in place of the oil. So people in rural environments would have a lower carbon footprint and a lower energy bill. And these sort of innovations, or whether it's the tidal lagoon or whatever, there's no shortage of these technologies and these ideas. What there's a shortage of is a government focus on greening the economy and powering us up in a sustainable way. Instead, they just go to their mates, the oil barons, who say, oh, you've had to do this windfall tax, give us 90% back to drill more oil, destroy the environment, and look at the temperature outside. It's absolutely disgraceful. So I'll come to it. And clearly, and there's the tidal lagoon. The government wouldn't even help us with the tidal lagoon. I mean, that's not going to stop, is it? But of course, they said, oh, we're not helping that. It doesn't make any sense, even though it's going to go on for over 100 years. And the council have had to do it with the Welsh Government on their own. And so basically, we need a government who cares about people in terms of stopping them starving. And that's another thing we're going to see. People may have heard of Professor Marta Sen, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who had the joy of teaching me on one occasion, who wrote Poverty and Famines, who found that famines weren't a function of food shortages, but they were a function of high prices and low wages and some food logistics. And that's precisely what we're now finding in the UK. He wasn't writing about the UK at the time, and then you see pockets of starvation. We should stop that. Government is empowered to stop that. It should stop it, whether it's indexation of social security, the universal credit, increasing rents, investing in Greek technologies, and stopping always obeying everything the oil barons say. I'll leave it there.